Notice, too, the dirt street, the plank sidewalk in front of the house, the water barrel, and the shelves that are visible through the 4-pane window. Upstairs, the second oldest of the Goulding girls, Oliva, or Leaf, peers out for the photographer from behind the lace curtains. Leaf is 15 years old. And on the other side is the only known image we have of the mother of the Gouldings, the former Margaret Souders, who had married her husband 19 years earlier. We can't tell much from this photograph, but she appears to be a trim, perhaps even thin woman, her hair worn in a pulled-back style and parted in the middle. Our eyes take in her dark-colored, high-necked dress and the elongated shape of her hands and fingers. So this 1889 photograph shows that the Drakes and Gouldings were indeed closely knit. Notice that no matter how hot it may have been, virtually everyone in the photograph is wearing enough clothing to cover all but the hands and feet. This was partly a fact of the modesty-driven dress codes of the 19th century, but was also a carryover from farm life which required shielding from the sun. Directly across the street from the Goulding house was the Drake home, and it was here that George Drake spent part of his teenage years. Except for the shingles, the new roof, and the roof over the doorways, it looked rather as George Drake would remember it in later years. The patriarch of the family, Francis W. Drake, is shown here on his 80th birthday, surrounded by 3 generations. On the left is Charles E. Drake, his eldest son, then 55 years old. On the right is Charles' son Carl, then 29, and Louis Drake, Carl's 3-year-old son, is seated on his great-grandfather's lap. Of Louisa Adeline Holt, who had married F. W. Drake in October of 1856, we have regrettably but one image, a tintype, taken when she was perhaps 16 years old. But it's from her side of the family, the Holt side, that we have the oldest handwritten document in either side of the family's history. Written in sepia-colored ink, it's a poem entitled An Acrostic for Mrs. Elizabeth Holt. It was presented to her on July 6, 1836, as a token of respect from an adoring husband, Joab Holt, who had married the former Elizabeth Sweeney in December of 1834. Both were Virginians, from Harper's Ferry, later the site of abolitionist John Brown's famous raid in what was then Virginia but is now West Virginia. Being an acrostic, the letters of each line at the left margin spell out the name Elizabeth Holt. The verses read as follows: Enshrined in beauty and unsullied fame, let virtue blazon thy respected name. In sweetest lays the poet aims to sing, zealous a tribute to thy worth to bring. Around thy brows shall beauteous wreaths entwine, bright as the lustre of their virtues shine. Entwine the lily with the rose which shines, that in bright beauty with its thorn reclines. Happiness shall to thee its brightest gifts bestow. Oh, when you're done with all below the skies, let your dear spirit to its God arise, then claim the fidelity and eternal prize. The writer, a gentleman farmer born in Harper's Ferry in January 1813, hardly looked the part of a romantic poet. He farmed on what was then known as Quaker Ridge in Morgan County, and there he would associate with the Drakes. His hat covers a balding pate, a genetic tendency of the Holts that got passed down to the Drakes and their descendants. His wife was also born in Harper's Ferry in August of 1814. They had been married 18 years when they relocated from Virginia to Ohio, settling first in Belmont County and then Morgan County sometime between 1850 and 1852, as nearly as we can determine. Of the children of Joab and Elizabeth Holt, virtually all were successful. This is Dr. George Marshall Holt, born in Harper's Ferry in April of 1850, just before his parents would relocate in Ohio. He was active in a dental practice in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and also became a successful real estate investor in that area. He, too, as we can see, inherited the hairlessness of the Holt men. The same with Charles Edgar Holt, another of Joab's sons, who at 20 had a full head of hair. At 25, he had barely enough to make a semblance of a part in his thinned-out hair and grew a mustache to offset the sparse hair on top. His sister, Louisa Adeline, was the eldest of Joab and Elizabeth Holt's surviving children. She was still young, only 44, when she died in 1884, and while the older ones of her children, Annie, Charles Edgar, and William, or Willie, shown in a childhood photograph from the late 1860s, were already adults, there was young George, not yet 13, and a still younger child, Alice Josephine, or Joey, aged 10, who remained at home to be raised. With a farmer merchant father who had to work all the time, the children's care went to Louisa's younger sister, Emma Virginia Holt, who was born in Morgan County in August of 1852 and would live a long life, dying, ironically, on Christmas Day in 1928. In 1870, Emma had married the austere-looking Elijah Adrian, a farmer like most everyone else in Morgan County. Of the two, she was clearly the dominant one. Thoroughly self-confident, self-righteous in her Methodist beliefs, and bossy and shrewd in all of her dealings. Emma spoke with a confidence that gave her an air of intelligence, and she was exceptionally good at making cutting remarks in stilted language. If she considered someone not very bright, for instance, she would say, "What a pity that his organ of thought is so insufficiently developed." Aunt Em, as George T. Drake always called her, became the closest thing to a mother that he ever knew. Her feelings for him were just as strong, and in her last will and testament it is reflected. Her attorney, in fact, addressed the estate settlement to George, and as item 2 of her will shows, she gave George Drake one of the two largest sums, $100, in her modest estate. In later years, he and his wife Nellie opened their home to her, and she lived with them until 1918, when she gave them an ultimatum. She demanded that they not allow their eldest son, Dr. Bill Drake, to come home from Fort Hays, fearing that he would carry the dreaded flu that decimated hundreds of thousands of people in the epidemic of 1917. Emma didn't get her way and returned to her home in Malta, Ohio. To Nellie and the Drake children, she was an overbearing woman with a nasty disposition, but no matter. To her nephew George Thomas Drake she was always "Dear Aunt Emma Adrian." Years later, however, his namesake, George Jr., wrote beneath his father's handwriting a less flattering two-word description: "Horseshit." Perhaps the most interesting and intellectually the most commanding of F.W. Drake's generation was his brother, Henry Harrison Drake, named for the 9th U.S. President, William Henry Harrison. Harrison Drake was a farmer, contractor, and Civil War veteran, but above all he was what was then called a freethinker. In the predominantly religious Morgan County, Harrison Drake would flaunt his anti-religiosity by making sure in the summer months that he mowed his lawn on Sunday mornings so that the churchgoers would be sure to see him violating the Sabbath. Even his eating habits were nonconformist. He would eat only one kind of dessert, apple pie, and only then if the pie was smothered with thickly sliced tomatoes. He took his creed from one of the most powerful minds of the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the descendant of a long line of Congregationalist ministers who, it's generally agreed, gave America its first distinctive philosophical voice, and with Washington Irving, gave us our first distinctively American literature, after the flowering of the colonial period and the sermons and essays of Jonathan Edwards and the Mathers. In perhaps his most famous essay, Self-Reliance, Emerson wrote that a fierce sense of independence, nonconformity, and a return to nature as a living guide must be at the core of all human learning. In a passage from the essay Spiritual Laws, in the book of Emerson's essays that George Drake owned as a high school student, this passage is bracketed. In it, Emerson is stressing that nature teaches us that nothing exists for our convenience, and that we have to learn from nature in order to stop worrying about things like the climate, which we can't control. Nature, it says, will not have us fret and fume. When we come out of the caucus, or the bank, or the abolitionist convention, or the temperance meeting, or the transcendental club, into the fields and woods, she says to us, "So hot, my little sir?" Many of the Drake men were under Emerson's influence. One very much under his thrall was William B. Drake, George T. Drake's older brother, born in 1859, who had a thriving lumber business in Wellston, Ohio. In several of his later life letters to his brother, we can hear echoes of Emerson's passages on the glories of nature. In this April 1944 letter, when Will Drake was 85, he writes about the coming springtime.